Europe is burning, but that is no longer the most important part of the story, because the fires that have dominated headlines in France and Spain are now being followed by a much more worrying development. The danger is shifting east, and European officials are warning that countries including Greece, Italy, and parts of Central Europe could face increasingly serious wildfire conditions as the next phase of this heat wave develops. That changes the story completely. Because when a wildfire becomes a regional emergency, the question is no longer where the flames are burning right now. The question becomes, where will the conditions become dangerous next? In southwestern France, one of the largest fires has already burned an area roughly 4 times the size of Paris. More than 220,000 people have been evacuated in the Gironde region, while thousands of firefighters have been deployed to battle a blaze that has repeatedly resisted containment. In Spain, tens of thousands more people have been forced from their homes as major fires spread through several regions. Across France and Spain, the number of people displaced or otherwise affected by evacuation and shelter orders has climbed into the hundreds of thousands. And the conditions feeding these fires are exactly what firefighters do not want to see together: extreme heat, very dry vegetation, strong winds, and too little rainfall. When those ingredients align, a fire does not behave like a normal forest fire. It can accelerate, it can jump containment lines, it can create its own weather. And in some cases, the fire itself becomes part of the atmosphere around it. That has already happened in France, where a rare phenomenon known as a pyrocumulonimbus cloud developed above intense burning. These fire-generated thunderclouds can produce powerful updrafts, lightning, violent winds, and conditions capable of helping new fires ignite beyond the main fire front. So the terrifying part is not simply that Europe has huge fires, it is that some of these fires are becoming systems that are increasingly difficult to predict and contain. And now the map is changing. The European Union's Emergency Response Coordination Center says the wildfire threat is shifting from Western Europe toward countries such as Greece, Italy, and Central Europe, with the beginning of August considered a particularly important period for the evolving risk. European firefighting assets have already been deployed, while additional resources have been positioned farther east in anticipation of a worsening situation. And that means the next chapter of this disaster may already be forming, because Europe is not moving out of the danger zone is moving. To understand why officials are so concerned about what comes next, look at what is happening in France. The Gironde fire did not simply spread across a forest and stop. It became a massive, fast-moving emergency that pushed authorities into one of the largest evacuation operations seen in Europe in years. At its peak, the fire burned across roughly 42,000 hectares, an area around 4 times the size of Paris. More than 220,000 people were evacuated in the region, and firefighters have faced conditions that make every attempt at containment harder. Extreme temperatures, dry vegetation, shifting winds and terrain that can allow flames to move rapidly. That is what makes this different from the image many people have in their heads when they hear the words wildfire. A normal fire is already dangerous, but a fire in extreme weather can become something else. Wind can push flames into untouched vegetation. Heat dries that vegetation even further. The fire releases enormous amounts of energy, and that energy can change the local atmosphere. Suddenly, firefighters are no longer fighting only flames on the ground. They're dealing with smoke columns, sudden wind shifts, embers traveling ahead of the fire line, and new ignition points that can appear where people thought the danger had already passed. That is one reason containment can suddenly deteriorate after hours of progress. The fire doesn't need to look larger to become more dangerous. It only needs the atmosphere around it to change. And that's exactly why the current situation in Spain is so important. Spain has also been battling major fires while preparing for another period of intense heat and strong winds. Authorities have warned that the coming days could be particularly difficult because even fires that have been partially stabilized can flare up again when temperatures rise and winds strengthen. That gives us the first major lesson of this crisis. A fire being contained is not the same thing as the danger being over, and that distinction is going to matter even more as conditions shift east, because the countries now entering the center of attention are not starting from a blank map. They are inheriting a continent already dried out by prolonged heat, and that brings us to the second part of the story. This is the moment the story changes. France and Spain became the center of Europe's wildfire crisis. But now European officials are pointing toward Greece, Italy, and Central Europe. Not because the original fires are somehow physically traveling hundreds of kilometers across the continent. The danger is moving because the conditions that allow destructive fires to spread are moving. That distinction is critical. A wildfire in France does not need to reach Italy for Italy to be at risk. All Italy needs is the same dangerous combination: high temperatures, dry vegetation, strong winds, and limited rainfall, and those conditions can develop across huge distances. According to the EU's emergency response officials, the wildfire threat is increasingly shifting eastward, with Greece, Italy, and Central Europe becoming areas of concern as the heat wave develops. Resources have been positioned in eastern and central parts of Europe because authorities do not want to wait until the next major fire is already out of control before responding. And Greece has already provided a brutal warning about what that shift could look like as fires erupted farther east. 3 Greek firefighters were reported killed while battling the blazes. That alone tells you something important. The problem is no longer confined to Western Europe. The emergency response itself is now being tested across multiple countries at the same time. And Italy is watching closely as well. That's because the Mediterranean landscape can be especially vulnerable when long periods of heat and dryness combine with wind. A spark in the wrong place is one thing. A spark arriving after weeks of drying is something else entirely. Vegetation that would normally slow the progress of fire can become fuel, and once enough fuel is available, the difference between a manageable fire and a major emergency can become a matter of hours. That is why the eastward shift matters so much. This isn't simply a story about where fires are burning. It's a story about where the next fire could grow explosively. And there is another reason this moment is so dangerous. Europe has already seen how extreme wildfire seasons can become. The EU's 2025 fire season was the most severe on record in its Copernicus dataset, with more than 1 million hectares burned across 25 EU member states. So, European authorities are not looking at this year's fires in isolation. They are comparing today's conditions with a recent trend of increasingly destructive seasons, and that raises a much bigger question. What happens when the weather stops giving firefighters a break? Imagine trying to stop a wall of flames while the environment around you is actively helping the fire grow. That is essentially the problem firefighters are facing. The flame is only the visible part. Behind it is a chain reaction involving heat, moisture, wind, and fuel. When vegetation becomes extremely dry, it takes less energy to ignite. When temperatures rise, moisture disappears faster. When winds strengthen, the fire can spread more quickly and send embers into areas that have not yet burned. And when the fire becomes intense enough, it can generate powerful columns of rising air that alter conditions around it. That is how a wildfire can begin influencing its own environment. The pyrocumulonimbus phenomenon seen over severe French fires is an extreme example. A massive fire heats the surrounding air. That air rises rapidly. Moisture and particles are carried upward. A giant cloud can form above the fire, and under the right conditions, the storm-like system can generate lightning and strong winds of its own. In other words, the fire can start creating the weather that helps it survive. That is one of the reasons the current European crisis has become so difficult to manage. And it creates a dangerous feedback loop. Hot weather dries the landscape. Dry landscape increases fire risk. Fire increases heat and turbulence near the ground. Wind helps the flames spread. The flames produce more heat. And suddenly the original weather event is no longer the only thing controlling the disaster. The fire has become an active part of the system. This is also why the next few days matter so much. A wildfire doesn't need a dramatic change in conditions to become dangerous. Sometimes it only needs one bad combination at the wrong time: a stronger wind, a hotter afternoon, a sudden shift in humidity, a dry hillside, or a new ignition point behind the existing containment line. And that's exactly why officials are warning that the danger can move from one part of Europe to another. Because the atmosphere doesn't care where yesterday's fire was, it only cares where today's conditions are favorable. And right now those conditions are expanding into new regions. If France showed how large a wildfire can become, Greece is now showing how quickly the human cost can escalate. Wildfires have struck farther east as the heat wave continues, and 3 firefighters were reported killed while fighting fires in Greece. At the same time, communities have faced evacuations as crews attempt to prevent flames from reaching populated areas, and this is where the story stops being about statistics. Because every additional fire creates another evacuation zone, another road that has to be closed, another community that has to prepare to leave, another emergency crew that has to move into dangerous terrain. And when several countries are dealing with fires simultaneously, the pressure on firefighting resources becomes even more serious. That's one reason the European Union has been moving aircraft, equipment, and teams between affected areas while also pre-positioning resources farther east. The goal is simple: get there before the next emergency becomes impossible to contain. But preparation only works if the fire danger does not outrun it, and that is the real race happening now, not fire versus firefighters. Fire growth versus response time. The faster the fire accelerates, the less time authorities have to evacuate people, the less time communities have to prepare, and the less room there is for mistakes. That is why the eastward movement of the risk is so significant. It is giving governments a warning, but it is also giving them a shrinking window to act. Now look farther east, Italy, then Central Europe. These regions are increasingly entering the conversation because the same heat and dryness affecting Western Europe are creating dangerous fire conditions across a wider area. And this is where a developing disaster can become much larger than the original headlines suggest, because Europe is densely populated. Major cities, tourist areas, agricultural regions, and forests can sit surprisingly close together. A wildfire does not have to burn the largest possible area to become a major disaster. It only needs to threaten the right place: a town, a highway, a power line, a resort, a vineyard, an industrial site, or a densely populated urban edge. That's why the real measure of a wildfire crisis is not simply how much land has burned. It is what the fire is approaching. That is already visible in France, where the fires have threatened major communities in economically important areas around Bordeaux. And it is visible in Spain, where evacuations have affected residents and businesses across multiple regions. Now, the concern is that similar scenarios could unfold farther east. Not necessarily tomorrow, not necessarily everywhere, but in enough places that emergency planners have decided they cannot afford to assume the worst is over. And that is an important distinction. Officials are not saying every part of Italy or Central Europe will suddenly erupt in fire. They are saying the risk environment is becoming more dangerous, and those are two very different statements. The first is sensational. The second is what we actually need to watch. So what should we actually watch now? Not just the flames, watch the weather, watch the wind, watch humidity, watch where fire danger conditions are expanding, and especially watch what happens as Europe moves deeper into the next period of extreme heat. Because the biggest danger may not be the largest fire currently burning. It may be the new fire that starts when everyone assumes the crisis is finally calming down. That is how these situations can change. One region stabilizes, another suddenly ignites. A fire is contained in the morning, wind changes in the afternoon, evacuations are lifted, then a flare-up forces people out again, and the cycle repeats. That is already happening in parts of France and Spain, where firefighters have made progress in some areas while remaining deeply concerned about renewed fire activity as heat and wind increase. So the next few days are not about predicting one giant fire. They are about identifying whether Europe's wildfire threat is continuing to spread into new regions, and that is precisely what authorities are preparing for. The EU has already positioned firefighting resources in Eastern and Central Europe. That tells you something. They are not waiting for the next major headline. They are preparing for the possibility that the map will keep changing. There is one final reason this wildfire crisis deserves attention. Europe has spent years learning that extreme weather can arrive in clusters: heat, drought, wildfire, flooding, severe storms. And increasingly, these events can interact with one another instead of appearing as isolated disasters. The wildfire crisis we are seeing now is not happening in a vacuum. It is unfolding on a continent that has already experienced record-breaking fire seasons. Copernicus reported that 2025 was the EU's most severe wildfire season on record, with more than 1.07 million hectares burned across 25 member states. That does not mean 2026 will automatically surpass it, but it explains why today's fires are being watched so closely. European authorities know how quickly a bad season can turn into something much larger, and right now the most important signal may not be the size of the fire, it may be the direction of the risk. Because the fires started making headlines in the west, now officials are watching the east. And if the weather remains hot, dry, and windy, the map could keep changing. That is why the next chapter of this story has not been written yet. France may see more containment, Spain may regain control in some areas, but Greece, Italy, and Central Europe are becoming increasingly important parts of the equation. And that means Europe is facing a very different kind of wildfire threat. Not one fire, not one country, not one isolated disaster, a moving risk zone. A continent where the conditions are changing faster than the headlines. So when you look at the map tonight, don't only ask, where is the fire? Ask, where are the conditions becoming dangerous next? Because that is where the next chapter of Europe's wildfire crisis may begin.